All could make it tonight. I appreciate your attendance. I know you'd rather be up elsewhere, like eating food. So what I'm going to teach you tonight in the hour that we have together is I'm going to teach you about one way of reading and understanding poetry that will help you interpret other poems. And that's part of the argument for why it's important to learn Shakespeare if you want to understand English poetry. Because Shakespeare is one of the figures who is really at the beginning of English poetry. So if you can understand the way that he uses language and the themes that he develops through poetic devices, such as imagery, metaphor, simile, that sort of thing, then you can use your understanding of Shakespeare and apply it to other poets that you read in English. So if you make the effort to understand Shakespeare, then your ability to understand poets, other poets, becomes much easier. And also, I'm going to make an argument tonight, which is going to be new in some respects, is that by understanding Shakespeare, you can actually understand more complicated works, or seemingly more complicated works like Dostoevsky, or the existentialists like Camus and Sartre, because within Shakespearean sonnets there are also ideas that are similarly expressed by writers such as Dostoevsky and Camus. So that's part of the argument that I'm going to make tonight. And then, of course, the other part of my argument about why it's important to read Shakespeare is, of course, nicely translated for you into Mandarin. And this is the idea that if you read the Shakespearean plays, you get a better understanding of the Greek tragedies that come before, like Sophocles' Oedipus the King, or Euripides' the Medea. So that's the other argument I'm going to make tonight. Okay, so let's get started. How many of you have read Shakespeare before? Anybody read Shakespeare in here? Anybody read any English poetry?
Yes.
Okay, what have you read?
The Williams, in the 19th English literature.
Okay, so what poets did you read? 19th century is William Wordsworth. Okay, so do you know what poetic movement William Wordsworth is a part of? He's a part of the British Romantic poets. So we're talking the late 1790s, basically, until the 1830s, more or less. This is the British Romantic movement. Work. So it's important because the British Romantic poets were very much influenced by Shakespeare. And we're going to see a relationship between ideas and ways of writing poetry and the way ideas are expressed using certain poetic devices that are not only found in Shakespeare, but are found in the British Romantic poets. So if you understand Shakespeare, you're going to have a better understanding of the British Romantic poets, because they're coming out of that tradition. All right, good. Anybody read anything else besides William Wordsworth? All right, well, we're going to get to it tonight. Okay, so what we're going to start with is I'm just going to jump into the poem, because I think that's the best way to understand poetry, is you have to read it, right? If you want to learn about great paintings, where do you go? You go to a museum and you look at great paintings, right? That's how you become familiar with what's beautiful and what's not beautiful. You go and look at a bunch of paintings, right? You don't necessarily study a bunch of theory beforehand and then go to the museum. No, you go to the museum and you look at the paintings, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this poem, and then we're going to step back and I can show you the poetic devices that are being used. So let's take the first line. That time of year thou mayst in me behold. So what do we do when we're looking at a line of poetry? how do we try to figure out what it means?
By figuring out the mood of the poem.
Figuring out the mood of the poem. Well, okay, so I might ask you, what's the subject of this? Let's say this is a sentence, right? What's the subject of this sentence? Right?
Time
Like,
of the year.
okay, well, okay. So that time of year, you're saying that time of year is the subject, okay? That's what you're saying. All right? Now, if that's the subject, what's the verb? This is a good exercise.
Behold.
All right. So does a time of year behold? Can a time of year behold? What does behold mean? You behold me at the front of the class. What does that mean?
Present something.
If you behold me, that means you see me at the front of the class, right? So does a time of the year see something? This means yes. This means no. So a time of the year doesn't see anything, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we could safely say that this is not the subject, right? It's something else. You got the verb right. So the verb is mayst behold, right? What does mayst mean? It's just a fancy way of saying may. You may behold, right? Okay.
Oh, I think it's THOU.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, so what does thou mean?
You.
That's right, it's just a fancy way of saying you. Alright, so now we got the subject. And we got the verb. So now we understand something about the first line of the poem that we didn't understand before, right? So, you may behold, okay, so we got the subject, we got the verb, now we need an object of the verb, right? So, what is me? What is me? Is me a subject or is me an object?
Object.
Sounds like an object, right? You wouldn't say, me drive the car, right? No. You would say, I drive the car, right? So, me is the object. So, you may behold in me what? That time of year. There you go. So that means me is the indirect object, right? And time of year is the direct object. So now we understand the meaning of this first line, right? When you may behold in me that time of year. All right. So what's the question you're going to ask? What questions does that first line make you ask?
Who is you?
Well, okay, so who is you? That's a good question. Who is you? Well, it's the person that the poet is writing to, right? What's another question I might ask? What time of year? Right? What time of year is it? What's the answer to that question? So that's a good question. What time of year is it? Now, did we get an answer in the first line? No, we don't get the answer in the first line. Shakespeare doesn't want to finish the whole poem in the first line. Why would you read the rest of the lines? Right? You got to read the rest of the poem to find out the answer. The first line is the question. So where's the answer?
The next line.
Okay, what's the answer? When yellow leaves. Okay, so let's start here. When do you see yellow leaves in a tree?
Autumn.
That's it. Fall, autumn, right? Now, be nice. Am I in the spring of my life? No. Right? What season of the year are you guys in? If I'm not in the spring, what are you in? You're in the spring, right? So, might I be in the autumn? In the spring of my youth, I had long hair, like a girl. Do I have long hair anymore? No, it's all gone. Right? That would be one indication that I'm not in the spring of my life anymore, right?
Yeah.
So, Shakespeare is comparing one thing to another, right? What is it called when you compare one thing to another? Simile or metaphor. What's the difference between a simile and a metaphor? A simile uses what words? Like or as, right? To compare two things, right? A metaphor doesn't use like or as, right? It just says one thing is another, right? Okay, so that time of year thou mayst in me behold. So when you look at me, whoever thou is, you, right? The poetic you that Shakespeare is writing to, when you look at me, you see a certain time of year. Ah, what time of year is that? Well, when yellow leaves are none of you do hang. So, Shakespeare is making a metaphor in these first two lines. He's comparing one thing to another. What's he comparing? I gave you the answer. I said, you are in the spring of your life. I am clearly not. Right? So what am I comparing? Seasons of the year to what?
June.
That's right. Seasons of the year to the time of life. Right? So we could say spring is youth, summer, adulthood. Let's say fall is decline. And then what would winter be? Death. There you go. See how much information you got just in those first two lines? Now you're going to see this imagery of yellow leaves come up again. And guess what yellow leaves is going to mean? It's going to mean being in a state of decline, right? Wow. Where does that come from? Well, Shakespeare might not have been the first to use it in the English language, because, well, there's Chaucer and Milton, and there are others, right? But this is certainly one that he uses it again in the way that other poets had used it. And so this becomes a common theme in English poetry. So whenever you see this phrase, yellow leaves, the reader automatically thinks to him or herself, here the poet is telling us about a certain season of the year, a certain stage of life. Right? So yellow leaves just aren't pretty yellow leaves, they represent something. Right? Okay, so when you look at me, you see a certain time of year. That time of year is when yellow leaves and none of you do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold. Alright, so here, this third line, he continues this autumn imagery, right? This fall imagery. So, what does boughs mean? Yep.
Are these big branches?
Branches, that's exactly right. Branches, very good. Now, think about this verb, shake. Now, let's say I took off my coat, right? And I went outside. Say I took out my coat and I went outside. What would happen? That's right. I would shake. Why would I shake? Because it's cold. Now, do branches on trees shake because it's cold?
Because the wind.
That's right, because the wind. But look how he's using it here. He's saying shake against the cold. Right? Now, if I walk outside and I don't have my coat on, I'm going to shake. Right? Does the branch shake because it's cold? Does it shiver because it's cold? No, right? So, what's he doing here by using this verb?
Personification.
That's exactly right. What is personification?
Saying an object, like it's alive.
Giving a human characteristic to a non-human thing, right? The dog smiled at me. Really? Does the dog smile? No, right? The tree shakes against the cold. Trees don't shake against the cold. They don't feel cold like human beings do. He's giving a human characteristic to a non-human thing. He's personifying, right? So that personification helps with this comparison, right? So he's talking about himself, right? The personification helps you understand that really he's describing himself, right? Good. Now, let's think about this line. My coat. So, let's break this down into parts. What does bear mean? What does bear mean?
Barely with nothing.
Without covering, right? Without covering. Bare, right? Without covering. Okay, so ask yourself, what in these three previous lines has been described as lacking covering? What has been described as not having any covering? The boughs, right? Right? When yellow leaves are none or few do hang, right? None or few. What are the none or the few that are hanging on the boughs? Leaves, right? The tree is bald, right? It happens. I know you don't believe me, I used to have long, beautiful hair, but Grace can tell you, she's seen the picture. The branches are bald, right? They're without covering. Another thing, it's another part of the image that's reinforcing the time of year, because when do branches lose their leaves? Do they lose their leaves in the spring? No. Do they lose their leaves in the summer? No. When do they begin to lose those leaves? Fall. All right, now, think about the word ruined. What does ruin mean? What's a simple way of understanding the word ruined? Destroyed, something not new. I had this great BMW, it was brand new, and then I wrecked it, so it's ruined, right? What's a choir?
Singing group.
Group of singers. Now, this whole phrase, bear ruined choirs, describes one thing. What does it describe? The branches, right?
Yes.
Why? How does it describe the branches? Well, it goes back to this line, and you've already said it, right? What sound do those bare branches make as the wind blows through them on an autumn day? Yeah, it makes a whizzing sound, right? So he's comparing that to a choir, right? So he's personifying, right? They're singing a very sad song. Oh, my youth is gone, gone forever, right? They're going to chop me down and turn me into firewood, right? That's the sound that the wind makes as it blows through those bare branches, right? It's a sad choir, a bare, ruined choir, right? So now, do branches sing? No, branches don't sing. So when he gives a human characteristic to a non-human thing, what is he doing? That's exactly right. Personification. Very good. Now, this last part, he emphasizes the fact that we're in autumn, right? Where late, where once, right? Where once the sweet birds sang. When do sweet birds sing in the trees?
In the spring.
In the spring, right? So, are we in spring anymore? No, right? Once the birds sang in the trees, but they don't sing here anymore because we're not in that season anymore, right? So, if we go back to this metaphor, the seasons of the year represent the stages of life. What is the poet telling us about what stage of life he is in? Which one is he most certainly in? That's right, he's in decline. He's in decline. All right, very good. See how easy that was? No, thanks to Shakespeare. I wish I were as good as Shakespeare. If I were, I wouldn't be a teacher. I'd be a poet. Okay. So that's the first 4 lines. Now, what Shakespeare does is he sets us up for a pattern that he's going to repeat. And it has to do with this poetic device, simile metaphor, right? Comparing one thing to another, right? So in the first 4 lines, the thing that he's comparing one to another is the seasons of the year to the stages of life, right? So now when we're looking at the next set of 4 lines, we want to think to ourselves, okay, what is Shakespeare comparing one to the other? Because he's given us that model. He's going to follow that model. Okay, so we want to start like we did the first time. We want to think, what's the subject of the line? What's the verb of the line? What's the object of the line? If you ever get confused about a line of poetry in English, simply think to yourself, what's the subject? What's the verb? What's the object? You can make a lot of sense out of poetry if you just think in terms of what's the subject, what's the verb, what's the object. Okay? So, in me, thou seest the twilight of such day. Okay. So, what's the subject? You, thou. Okay? So you see what? In me you see what? Okay, the twilight of day, right? So this is indirect object, and this would be direct object, right? And then ceased would be the verb. So me, you see the twilight of day. All right, so now think back to our first metaphor. Our first metaphor is comparing the seasons of the year to the stages of life. Now, what is the second metaphor comparing? The stages of life to what?
Twilight of the
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. All right, so now sometimes what I do to help students understand poetry is you draw graphs. You make it kind of visual, or little designs. So I think of it this way. Okay, so we've got a time of day, twilight. Okay, as after sunset, so we've got another time of day, sunset, fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away. Then we got another time of day, black night. So now, which one of these times of day comes first? Really?
no, black night.
Really? That comes first?
Sunrise.
Well, we don't have sunrise in this poem. We have sunset, twilight, and black night. How about which comes last? Black night comes last. All right, we can all agree on that. Okay, so black night is last. What comes before black night? Twilight. Very good. You know, the vampire movie, whatever. I don't think Shakespeare had that in mind. All right, so then, what comes first?
Sunset.
Sunset. Okay, now, what stage of this day, as the poet has described it, is Shakespeare in? Is he in the sunset? Is he in the twilight? Or is he in black night?
Twilight.
He's in twilight. Very good. All right, now, do you notice anything about the way he describes the day? When you think about the day, what do you think about? Do you think about twilight first? No, when you think about day, what do you think about first? Sunrise, and then what? Morning, and then what would come after morning? Afternoon, right? And then maybe evening, right? You get some light in that day, right? But now, think about what the poet is giving us. Is he giving us the whole day?
No.
No. What is the poet focusing on? Is he? Yeah, the dark, right? The end of the day, right? So what do you think he's trying to emphasize about the stage of his life? Is it at the beginning, the middle, or really near the end? Getting closer to that black night? That's exactly right. That's why he doesn't give us morning, afternoon, and night. No, he wants to really emphasize it's getting closer to the end, right? I'm really in a state of decay. You can't tell it from all those great portraits, but yeah, he feels that he's getting older, right? That's why he's emphasizing the end of the day. So sunset, twilight, black night. Okay, so me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, right? So twilight after sunset, right? Which, by and by, black night doth take away. Black night does take away. Let's look at this. Black night does take away. Now, think about this. To take something, I take